everybody, welcome to the Ielts Self-Study Program. The purpose of this program is to give you access to tools and resources that you can use to start preparing for the Ielts test on your own. This is the first in a series of 8 videos, each with a specific focus. The purpose or focus of this video is to give you a broad introduction to the Ielts. What you'll see up on your screen right now is a complete list of the 8 videos, including a suggested viewing order. We highly recommend that you watch the first 3 videos and the last one in this specific sequence. You have a bit more flexibility in terms of the self-study skill videos. You might choose to follow the order that you see on your screen, or you might choose to start with the skill or skills that you feel you need to spend more time preparing for. As I mentioned earlier, the purpose of this video is to give you a broad introduction to the Ielts test. We're going to do this by taking a look at an overview of Ielts, discussing the question, which Ielts test should you take, talk a little bit about standardized testing, take a detailed look at the Ielts test format, answer a question a lot of test takers ask, should you take the Ielts test on paper or on computer, round off with some testing information and some links to resources. Let's start off by expanding on the Ielts acronym, which means each of the letters stands for something. In its expanded form, the Ielts stands for the International English Language Testing System, and it's designed to assess the English language ability of people who intend to study or work where English is a language of communication. Why Ielts, you may ask? Well, one obvious answer is global recognition. It's recognized all over the English-speaking world, obviously the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States, but in practically every other country on the planet as well. In terms of the test format, it's the original 4 skills test. It tests international English. One of the unique features of the Ielts test is that it has a face-to-face speaking test component. As I mentioned earlier, the test can be taken on paper or on computer. The results are available in 13 days for the test on paper and 3 to 5 days for the test on computer. Now, which Ielts test is best for you? In order to answer this question, it's important to be aware of and be familiar with the 2 Ielts modules. The first is the academic module, and it's designed for test takers who want to gain entry to university or college, or maybe for professional registration and recruitment purposes. And it assesses the ability to study or train at undergraduate or postgraduate level. The general training module, on the other hand, is usually meant for people who want to immigrate, or for vocational secondary education, language training, and work experience. And it assesses survival skills in a broad social and educational context. The simplest and most effective way to figure out which test to take is to confirm with the receiving organization. The Ielts is assessed on a 9-band scale, starting from 1, which denotes a non-user, all the way up to band 9, which signifies an expert user. Please feel free to pause right now if you want to read the descriptions in more detail, specifically of the band score that you have. Once you've completed your Ielts test, you will receive what is known as a test report form, which will contain your information as well as a detailed breakdown of your scores. One personal copy of the test taker form will be sent to you, the test taker, and up to 5 electronic report forms can be sent for free to receiving organizations. If there are more than 5 copies required, there will be a courier charge. Now, before we look at the Ielts test in more detail, I think one important thing to keep in mind is that the Ielts is an example of a standardized test. But what is standardized testing? Well, a standardized test is one that's conducted under the same conditions and marked using the same assessment criteria, no matter where or when the test takes place. And these are 2 reasons why the Ielts test is globally recognized and accepted. But in terms of what we want to focus on in this video, standardized testing has another meaning that might be more important for us at this point. And that is, standardized test is one with the same format. And what do I mean by this? I mean by the way the test is structured in terms of duration, number of questions, parts, things like that. It's exactly the same. It never changes. So the first step of preparing for the IELTS test is becoming familiar with the format, and that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. The IELTS sets the standard in English language proficiency standardized testing, and it tests the 4 basic skills of the English language: listening, reading, writing, and speaking. This, in fact, is the sequence of the test as well. You start off with the listening, then the reading, then the writing, and finally the speaking. There is a bit more flexibility in terms of the speaking. In countries with a high volume of test takers, you might be asked to come in to do the speaking test on a separate day. Or if you're doing the IELTS on computer, you might start off with the speaking test and do the rest of the test later on in the day. But the listening, reading, writing sequence never varies. It's always exactly the same. We're now going to take a detailed look at each of these sections, starting off with the listening test. The listening test, in terms of audio recorded time, lasts for about 30 minutes. And if you're doing the IELTS on paper, you will get 10 extra minutes to transfer your answers onto the official answer sheet. If you're doing the IELTS on computer, because you're typing the answers directly onto the screen, you will get 2 minutes of checking time. It consists of 40 questions, and those questions are divided into 4 parts, or 10 questions per part. It's important to remember that each recording will only be played once. Now, guys, I mentioned that the IELTS is a standardized test, and one way that sort of plays out in terms of the listening test is that what you're going to listen to in each of the parts is also fixed or standardized. It never changes. So let's take a look at how the listening test is constructed in terms of the parts. Part 1 is a conversation between 2 people in an everyday context, social or transactional. Part 2 is going to be a monologue set in an everyday social context. Part 3 is a conversation between 2 to 4 people set in an educational or training context. And Part 4 is a monologue on an academic subject. Just going through these parts, I'm sure you guys would have noticed a pattern. So it goes basically conversation, monologue, conversation, monologue. And that's a very simple way to remember the way the listening test is structured. It's also important to remember that the first 2 parts are general and the last 2 parts are more academic. Let's take a look at the range of listening task types you could be asked to answer during the test. These include multiple choice, matching, relating a plan, map, or diagram, completing a form, notes, table, flowcharts, or summary, sentence completion, and short answer questions. It's also extremely important to remember that the questions are designed so that the answers appear in the order that they're heard in the audio. How is it marked? You'll get 1 mark for every correct answer, and there's no negative marking, which means there's no penalty for answering a question incorrectly. So what does this mean? Basically, it means you should never leave a question unanswered. Because there's no penalty, you might as well guess, even if you're unsure. Underneath, you'll see a table that shows how the raw score out of 40 is converted into a bland score. So generally, for example, in order to get a band 7, you'll need to get 30 questions out of 40. Right. Let's move on to the reading test. The reading test lasts for 60 minutes. This is inclusive of transfer time, which means you're not going to get extra transfer time to transfer your answers to the answer sheet if you're doing the IELTS on paper. It consists of 3 sections, totaling 2,150 to 2,750 words, and it comprises of 40 questions. Now, this is one part of the test where there's a difference between the academic and general training modules. In terms of the academic module, it consists of 3 sections, all of which are comprised of long texts. These texts or passages can be taken from books, journals, magazines, or newspapers, and they're more relevant to study. The general training, on the other hand, also consists of 3 sections, but 2 of them have shorter texts, and the last one has a longer text. These texts or passages can be taken from notices, advertisements, handbooks, official documents, books, magazines, and newspapers, and they're more relevant to life and work in a speaking country. As you can see, in terms of the duration, number of sections and questions, the modules are exactly the same. So the only significant difference is the source and the type of passages. Task types. You'll see them up on your screen right now, and you'll notice that they're very similar to the listening test. But there are a few that are unique. So, for example, identifying the writer's use of claims and matching headings to paragraphs. It's important to remember that the task types are exactly the same for both the academic and general training modules. So again, the only significant difference is the source or the type of application. In terms of how it's marked, again, very similar to the listening, 1 mark for every correct answer, and again, no negative marking, so there's no penalty for answering correctly. These two tables show how the raw score out of 40 is converted into band score for each of the modules. And if you look closely, you'll see that there is a difference between how the scores are converted. Many test takers assume the general training is easier, but as you can see, the marking and the conversion is a bit more stringent. Let's move on to the writing test. The writing test lasts for 60 minutes or 1 hour, and it comprises of 2 tasks. We recommend that you spend a maximum of 20 minutes for task 1, and at least or a minimum of 40 minutes on task 2. Task 1 is the second significant difference between the academic and general training modules. In the academic writing task 1, you'll be asked to prepare a report based on some sort of visual information, which could be a graph, table, chart, or diagram, and write a minimum of 150 words. Let me show you an example of what this looks like. You might be presented with, for example, in this case, a line graph. And if you look at the instructions, you will have to write or prepare a report that summarizes the information by selecting and recording the main features and making comparisons where relevant. The general training writing task 1, on the other hand, will require you to write a letter requesting information or explaining the situation. Again, doing this in a minimum of 150 words. Again, let's look at an example. You live in a room in college which you share with another student. However, there are many problems with this arrangement and you find it very difficult to work. So you need to write a letter to the accommodation officer at the college, and in the letter, describe the situation, explain your problems and why it is difficult to work, and say what kind of accommodation you would prefer. As you can see from the task, you will be given a general outline of the situation, be told who you need to write the letter to, and also what you need to cover in the letter. Writing task 2 is exactly the same for both the academic and general training modules, and you will have to write an essay in response to a point of view, argument, or problem, this time producing a minimum of 250 words. Let's take a look at an example of an essay topic. You'll see it up on your screen right now. Children who are brought up in families that do not have large amounts of money are better prepared to deal with problems of adult life than children brought up by wealthy parents. To what extent do you agree or disagree with this opinion? In terms of how both tasks are marked, there are 4 fixed assessment criteria for each of the tasks. In terms of task 1, the assessment criteria include task achievement, coherence and cohesion, lexical resource, and grammatical range and accuracy. There are 4 assessment criteria for task 2 as well. The first assessment criteria is slightly different from task 1. It's task response. The other 3 assessment criteria are the same: coherence and cohesion, lexical resource, and grammatical range. There's a lot more information about the assessment criteria, including the link to the public band descriptors in our writing self-study video, so please make sure you check that out. Let's finally look at the speaking test. I mentioned earlier that one of the unique features of the speaking test is that it is a one-on-one, face-to-face interview. It consists of 3 parts, lasting 11 to 14 minutes. And in terms of, again, the structure, it's standardized and it's exactly the same. Part 1 is an introduction or interview where you're going to be asked basic questions about familiar topics. This will last for about 4 to 5 minutes. The examiner might, for example, say, let's talk about accommodation, and then ask you a series of questions about this topic, including maybe what kind of accommodation do you live in? How long have you lived there? What do you like about living there? And what sort of accommodation would you most like to live in? Part 2 is known as the long